are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. In a world filled with chaos, politics, as usual, you might say, goes on. Certainly the political process goes on. And here to discuss some very interesting recent developments with us is our good friend, Daniel Marans. Daniel, of course, for those of you who don't know, actually part of the Zero Hour many years ago. He's gone on to a great career at HuffPost as a national reporter covering politics. We always look forward to reading him and sharing his insights. So first of all, Daniel Marans, welcome back to the program.
Great to be here as always, Richard.
Well, great to have you. And you've written several interesting pieces lately. And the one I wanted to start with, because it links so closely with developments in the Middle East as well as here, is one that was headlined Top Pro-Israel Group Reshapes Democratic Primaries with Multi-Million-Dollar barrage, and subheading AIPAC and its allies aim to combat rising pro-Palestinian sympathy among Democrats. First of all, tell us what you found in this, and then maybe we can talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, so I think what might come as news to some people is that prior to this 2022 midterm election cycle, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is the top pro-Israel lobby, sort of legendary for its power on Capitol Hill, and I think they're proud of that. I don't think they would deny that, has actually, prior to this election cycle, not directly endorsed candidates, not had a federal political action committee, and not had a super PAC. And one might ask, well, how is it that they developed such political might? What they did what they did in the past was they had sort of a network of affiliated bundlers, PACs that would do bundling directly, and that is how they wielded power inside campaigns. And I think there was just a general understanding that an AIPAC stamp of approval or a stamp of disapproval could unlock or unleash lots of money on your side or against you. And I think that in addition to sort of the kind of cultural ways and persuasion that they do engage in, right, that there is an intellectual debate here that they're very good at waging as well, but they did wield money influence just with greater subtlety and in a way that maybe kept the organization itself's hands clean. What they've clearly decided is that in a world in which you now have, instead of 0 Democrats voting against sort of reinstatements of military aid to Israel or things like Iron Dome, which admittedly is defensive technology, instead of 0 Democrats voting to voting to not, instead of 0 Democrats not voting to condemn BDS, there's now in each of these different categories something ranging from like 5 to 15, sometimes even 30 or 40 if we're talking about Andy Levin's bill to restrict how U.S. aid is used in the occupied territories. So you've got kind of a small but significant contingent in the House especially, but of course it has a complement in the Senate and people like Bernie Sanders. And that is breaking with the bipartisan consensus that the only ways that the United States ever weighs in on this conflict is with the gentlest of finger wags for the Israelis. I mean,
right.
You'll remember, obviously, President Obama did his share of finger wagging, but and he got a ton of blowback for it, but it never really had teeth. Right. So I think that's what they're afraid of. And so they've stepped it up dramatically. And I haven't crunched the numbers, but I think it's quite clear that when they're dropping $1 million, sometimes $1.5 million, $2 million in a single House primary, after a couple cycles in which that was sort of the exclusive province of Democratic majority for Israel, and they're still in the mix too, that I would say that even in absolute terms, the dollar figures we're looking at here are unprecedented in terms of the pro-Israel lobby, and their specific fight is against the left wing of the Democratic Party.
You know, to me, this is a really important story, Daniel, and I'm really glad that you flagged it. And one of the reasons why I find it so important is that, you know, and I can speak not just as a journalist, but as, you know, a longtime critic of AIPAC and of the way the occupation is, the occupation itself and so on. But the fact is, I think they're right. I'm going to try to phrase this carefully. I think they're right to perceive a threat to their perspective from what's happening here, because, you know, as I view it, the small but growing contingent of Democrats willing to seriously criticize Israeli military policy, they're small in number compared to the Democratic caucus on Capitol Hill as a whole, but they reflect a growing number of younger people, especially, including younger Jews, who are also critical. So I think there's a feedback loop, right, where you elect more leaders who are willing to criticize Israel. It reinforces public, especially among liberal voters, criticism of Israel. And I think they're correct to perceive that this endangers their perspective, which was unchallenged for so long. But I think what you've highlighted, and it's so important, is that they're really bringing out, financially speaking, big guns to try to combat this. Do you have any sense of how this is being taken among Democrats on Capitol Hill? Because obviously this is an intra-democratic battle. This is not, you know, I don't think you'll have Republicans criticizing the occupation or whatever. So we're really talking about, you know, going after Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, a few others. Do you have any sense of how this is playing, the awareness of this money is playing out in the Democratic caucus?
It's a good question, and I'm not 100% clear on that as yet. I think that AIPAC, in tandem with the Israeli government, has obviously damaged itself in the eyes of some Democrats because of, I mean, it really all goes back to the Iran nuclear deal and the fact that this was such an important achievement for President Obama, that then Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, you know, thumbed his nose at the president by openly declaring his opposition to this policy in Congress, in a speech to Congress, that AIPAC went along with that in lockstep, approvingly. And now, of course, you have this interesting phenomenon, which is that the whole phenomenon of being a bipartisan single issue organization in a post-January 6th context can create heartburn for you. And so you have J Street, a more liberal pro-Israel organization, and you have other progressives condemning them because they've endorsed 3/4 of the Republican electeds who objected to the 2020 election certification. Now, in a pre-January 6th context, that makes perfect sense for AIPAC, right? Their whole thing is, you could be, you know, we don't care what you do in your personal life. We don't care what you do in any other part of policy. We're creating a very simple, open permission structure here to agglomerate as much of a policy firewall on the 2 or 3 things that we care about, right?
Right.
I do think that now that Nancy Pelosi and Leader Hoyer and Clyburn, they are all among their endorsees, Chuck Schumer. And so maybe my next story is asking them, like, how do you feel about this, that they're endorsing these insurrectionists? I think that it's all realpolitik, and I suspect, but what could be interesting is this, you know, and I didn't get too far into it, but I did talk about it a little bit on Twitter, which is Andy Levin's race, where he's drawn into another district with a fellow Democrat. Here's a progressive Jewish guy who really has never said anything all that inflammatory, but has introduced the legislation that would restrict how U.S. aid could be used He's running against a non-Jewish elected member, Haley Stevens, who has taken a more AIPAC type line. And I think the question that some people might ask is like, okay, if there's an open race, or if there's somebody whose rhetoric that, you know, is quite clearly on one side of the spectrum, fine. But if the line is now that they're going to declare scorched earth war on you, even if you're a Jewish guy who I think identifies as a Zionist, but just happens to take a progressive stance, I could see that, you know, becoming, you know, a greater point of conflict. And I think that we're already seeing some of how that's reverberating a little bit in the public in terms of short-term blowback. Specifically, I'm thinking of in North Carolina, where the state party's Progressive Caucus withdrew its support from a candidate when it found that you know, at that time it was just that a majority of her first quarter fundraising had been bundled by AIPAC supporters. Then it subsequently emerged that AIPAC Super PAC is spending $1.5 million in her race. And so I think there are these you know, kind of sweet little parts of the country where primaries have always been quiet affairs, and the primaries are the only thing that matters, and they are a little gobsmacked by the amounts of money that are being spent. And I think that, you know, that, as you said, that there is a feedback loop between the public and the electeds, and especially on an issue like this, the electeds are a lagging indicator. I do think that ultimately it will come to bite them. But, you know, as we're seeing, there are interest groups that just live for the next election cycle. And if you can keep deferring action, it allows the people you're defending to change the landscape on the ground. And I think in the near term, notwithstanding the blowback, it's going to work.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the other dimension of this, Daniel, is of interest to me, is they used to do this with their old strategy too, as did the gun lobby and some other single issue groups. The intimidation factor. You know, you have people who have wavered. Representative Jamal Bowman, I believe, voted for Iron Dome funding, and you have AOC abstaining on a vote and then crying over it. And after she received criticism, and by the way, I'm not knocking her. I'm sure she's under tremendous pressure. But so you have that sort of, look what can happen to you, right? We'll do this to you. And the figures you cite are pretty stunning. You mentioned that race in North Carolina that is perhaps not insignificantly. They've put in nearly $1 million so far, $893,000.
Yesterday, the new disclosure came out. They're up to close to $1.5 million.
$1.5 million, which is not only in support of Senator Valerie Fouché, but against a Pakistani American who would become the youngest Muslim woman, I believe, in the Congress, Nida Alam.
Right.
So, you know, that
she would be the youngest woman, period, if she were elected, because she's 28, and AOC was, I think, 29 when she took office. So, and the first Pakistani American member of Congress, and the only the third Muslim, and obviously she, like Ilhan Omar, she is observant.
Right.
So
that's, you know, obviously they're reading something there. One of the interesting things to me about your article too, one of the other interesting things, Daniel, is, and again, we're talking with Daniel Marans of HuffPost, is that, you know, I don't get the sense that AIPAC particularly wants to be a right-wing organization. They're a single issue organization. I don't think they really care, as long as they can, you know, protect their, you know, their primary concern. But it seems to me, looking at the way this, first of all, you document large amounts of money, as you said, $15.7 million for United Democracy Project, their Super PAC, as well as $3.5 million. You know, already spent $3.5 million as of the last figures. But what's clear, looking at least the 6 bullets or 5 bullets you laid out, it's all right-leaning Democrats against the left, as you've already said. Chantel Brown, who just prevailed against Nina Turner, Steve Irwin against Representative Summer Lee in Pennsylvania, Don Davis against Senator Erica Smith. We've already talked about Fouché and Alam being not only Muslim, but the more progressive of the two, Cuellar, the conservative, and timely now, basically anti-abortion Democrat against challenger Jessica Cisneros. So in effect, whether, I don't know their thinking, but whether they want to be a conservative Democratic force or not, that's where they're becoming. And, I wonder about the long-term implications of that for pro-Israeli politicking in Washington. Do you get what I'm driving at?
I think so. I think you're saying that if this doesn't erode their bipartisan sheen, it can certainly make clear that they're taking sides in the Democratic Party civil war. And right. I would complicate that just a little bit, which is that I think when it's a relative choice between the more progressive candidate, I think they and many different sort of pro-Israel interest lobbies have concluded that there's just no discussion to be had with the squad, that it's kind of like a virus that needs to be stamped out. I think that there is kind of like but when you those are the 5 races, right, where their Super PAC United Democracy Project is active. And if you go through them, Don Davis in North Carolina is a blue dog conservative Democrat who they're supporting. Henry Cuellar is a blue dog conservative Democrat. The other 3, Steve Irwin, Valerie Fouché, and Chantel Brown, are basically like mainstream progressives who are what might be called PEP or PEEP, progressive on everything except Palestine, right? And I think they're really taking advantage of the fact that there is just not a big, passionate, and organized enough constituency for whom being pro-Palestine or not is the deciding factor, the way it is for people who are pro-Israel. Right. And one of the things I tried to sort of suss out in this article is whether there is any planning going on the not just left-leaning Jewish side of the spectrum, as embodied by AIPAC, which has also for the first time started their own super PAC, but is doing spending in the $100,000 range.
Oh, you're talking about J Street, not AIPAC.
J Street, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
J Street, yes, the liberal pro-Israel group. Right. But not just that, but what I tried to suss out is whether, Arab Americans or people who for whom this is, maybe a kind of family affair on the pro-Palestinian side, Arab Americans or Muslim Americans of different ethnicities, are they, stockpiling their political weapons? Do they have a thought to try to find a way to assemble these kinds of resources? Now, my understanding, from talking to people who are active in this, is that there has been a lot more bundling. It's not been done under a particular banner, though, and a super PAC capable of spending 6 figures, let alone 7, is just not really in the offing. And at least from a figure like Jim Zogby, who's a stalwart, dyed-in-the-wool progressive, not necessarily even desirable. But I think the question needs to be asked is, what are the alternatives? Because when Jamal Bowman won his race in 2020, he won it because a progressive super PAC got on the air before Democratic Majority for Israel and set the tone and spent more than $1 million doing it. Now, maybe the left doesn't have the resources to do that in more than 1 or 2 or 3 races. But it seems to me that is a question that's worth confronting tactically. Finally, the other thing I would say in terms of the blowback and the bipartisan image is that the problem you're encountering is whether it's Dem Party leadership in the person of figures like Jim Clyburn, in the entity of the Congressional Black Caucus PAC, in the form of this sort of inscrutable crypto billionaire funded super PAC Protect Our Future, which is supposedly sort of powered by concern about pandemic preparedness and other sort of pet projects of the Silicon Valley effective altruism movement. They are working in tandem with AIPAC and with other center-right, right-leaning pro-Israel groups because they hate the squad as well for similar but overlapping, different but overlapping reasons. And so I think that, if you're Nancy Pelosi and you have an existing relationship with AIPAC anyway, and, they're taking care of that thorn in my side.
Right.
Then,
and I can keep my hands clean, right? I don't have to even raise a finger in it. Yeah. That's a great point. Daniel, there was one quote in it and maybe this is a little bit of an aside, but it just really caught my eye, and it is from James Zogby, and he's been on the program. He's a friend. He's very reasonable, moderate Arab American activist, progressive, and not that it should matter, but Christian, not Jewish, and all that, from my hometown, Utica, New York. So I feel a certain bonding there.
And he sounds like it too. He's got that upstate New York kind of Midwestern sounding accent.
Do you know that I had, when we moved downstate near New York City, I actually went to speech therapy in the 3rd grade because I had that accent so thickly that the other kids in school couldn't understand me. But it still comes out once in a while. But he actually, and I'm looking for it here, but he actually said, we'll remember that Ilhan Omar got in a little trouble because she said of AIPAC funding for races, it's all about the Benjamins, which is, a rap song title, all about the money. And to me, I think she stepped in it, I'm sure inadvertently, because you and I know Benjamin is a common Jewish name, right? So even though the song maybe didn't allude to race or religion, when she said it's all about the Benjamins, it kind of triggered, well, who are you talking about? Benjamin Cardozo or, somebody. But so.
It's my middle name, by the way. Just as
is it? It's a great, it's a beautiful
Daniel
name.
Benjamin Marans.
Yeah. So Jim actually said, Jim Zogby, it certainly makes Ilhan Omar's "It's All About the Benjamins" comment seem less problematic than it appeared at the time. And I guess what struck me about that, other than a very mild, genteel guy like Jim saying that, is it signals to me a tonal shift. Do you know what it's like? While AIPAC is doing this, it feels like it's sort of, what's the word? It's almost giving nerve or strengthening the spine of the anti-AIPAC crowd. And it may be, we should ask Jim back on to talk about it himself, but it seems to me that, this may be the start of a more open confrontation and debate between the very small, we could say pro-Palestinian or progressive group on this issue, and the rather larger pro-Israeli group. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, the term that comes to mind is sort of a mask off moment a little bit, right? Yeah. It's sort of like, it's like anything, right? If you can get it done without having to get as nasty or without having to make it about big money, then obviously that would seem to be preferable. And I think though that there is I think there's a calculation that whatever the trade-offs on the part of AIPAC, that it's worth it in the near term. I spoke to an AIPAC donor who thinks that they will actually lose donors, sort of grassroots donors over this, that there are going to be people who are just uncomfortable with it. I mean, AIPAC has a lot of normie Jewish Democratic supporters who just think that they're the pro-Israel guys. Right. And obviously what you have to acquire through fear is always going to be less foundationally stable than what you acquire through love and persuasion. And as much as we like to deny it, AIPAC had a whole lot of that going for it for a long time. And so, yes, I do think this is like sort of a brute force stage of the game. But again, we're in it. I'm not quite as optimistic as you, from a left perspective, which is that I think that this is the establishment strikes back. I think that the high watermark on excitement around left-wing candidates was somewhere between 2018 and 2020. At this current juncture, I think the Bernie movement has died down for completely understandable reasons, and we're now entering a stage where the reality is greater fear about what kind of Democrat is able to win in a lot of these districts. Now, mind you, a lot of these left-wing Democrats have only really had success anyway in deep blue seats and deep blue states, but it's a spirit that's permeated everything. And then within those left-wing candidates who are still plowing through in these deep blue seats, the question they're asking themselves is it worth it to die on this hill? And who's going to have my back if I do? And I think the answers that the left has produced thus far have been embarrassing, because as far as I can tell, the most hardcore grassroots pro-Palestine organization with radical politics is the Democratic Socialists of America, and I think they've humiliated themselves by having these public debates over whether to oust Jamal Bowman for visiting Israel, under the auspices of J Street, things like that basically tell a left winger, you're damned if you do, and certainly the money's not going to be there, but the moral and sort of volunteer support probably won't be there either. Now, there is a silver lining from, I think, your perspective and from the perspective of our listeners, though I try not to betray my complete perspective on this, which is that they tried to go after Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and failed miserably. I don't think Jamal Bowman's going anywhere. I mean, one of the reasons I think that they are going so hard here on these races where there's an open seat or where they think they can get a foot in edgewise is that aside from defeating Nina Turner in open combat, and that was a very high profile, scalp to hold up, they have had a much harder time dislodging their arch enemies. And
right. Now, on the other hand, they've been able to prevent new arch enemies. Well, it looks like you're reporting on Nita Olam in North Carolina. It looks like she way out, very progressive Bernie person, as well as observant Muslim, way ahead in fundraising. And then, as you put it, the dam burst. Her opponent picked up a flood of influential endorsements, donations, super PAC investments. Now, I can tell you, Daniel, that a lot of our listeners will be upset, at a negative analysis of what's going to happen to the left. But, I take the view that we've got to take, that I have opinions and I express them, that we have to take a cold, hard look at what we're dealing with. And a revolution is not a dinner party, as somebody said. And we've got to see things as they are. I think Alam, who seemed to have a good road ahead of her, is now in deep trouble. And May 17th is her primary. So I know you're going to have to go. I wish there's so much more we could talk about. Any closing words before you leave us?
Yes. I mean, I just one more example from my reporting, and,
Sure.
and I had written about this back in February ahead of the March 1 Texas primary, but a really interesting case that I think exemplifies what I'm talking about and what you referred to as preventing new enemies from taking hold is that one of the people who I guess will be joining the squad effectively in January is a guy by the name of Ksar. a former Austin City Council person who is now the Democratic nominee in a safe Democratic district that they call Fajita Strip type district because it is gerrymandered to include parts of Austin, but then stretch all the way down to San Antonio. He is, I mean, in Austin, I mean, he is as much a driving force for Austin sort of taking on progressive and radical causes in the past 5-7 years as anybody. And he made a decision before his primary to write a letter to a prominent Austin rabbi and say, I'm not for BDS. I hope to visit Israel and the Palestinian territories. And in terms of that whole U.S. aid thing, obviously all U.S. aid needs to comply with, all recipients need to comply with human rights law, but I would never, but it has to be all of them, right? And I would never discriminate against a specific country. It needs to be dealt with at once. And to me, that was like I'm not going to single out Israel, or I'm not going to immediately take this on. Now, does that mean that he becomes a co-sponsor of Andy Levin's bill, which talks about restricting how aid is used rather than conditioning it? I don't know. But to me, that's an example of somebody surveying the landscape and saying, I don't want $1 million spent against me. I'm going to try to do what I can. And he was lucky enough to have not really said it much about this particular issue beforehand. DSA dropped him. He still won handily in his primary.
That's interesting.
And I think, on the one hand, look, we've been talking about Nida Alam. She tweeted in 2018 the words, just simply, this was the tweet, the United States of Israel, and she's since apologized for that. That's sort of maybe a more explicit version of the Benjamin's tweet, right? And hard to know whether the target would have been on her back anyway, because I don't think Erica Smith in North Carolina's first up against Blue Dog Don Davis has anything comparable in her repertoire. But it's that whiff of Squad, of Bernie World, and that's enough. And obviously, the questions that get raised then about identity as well. So
absolutely, yeah. It's that's
the fine little point I'm putting on it, and I have an extra 5 minutes, by the way, as it turns out. If you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll probably have to have you back to talk about the whole issue of anti-Semitism itself, because it's so nuanced and it's politicized, and a group like AIPAC will politicize it. But, Judaism is an identity. It is so it seems to me a Greg Ksar, is that how it's pronounced?
I believe so, yeah.
That he, among other things, is responding cleverly, and I don't mean that in a negative way, smartly, to the accusations of anti-Semitism that are based on, quote unquote, treating Israel differently from other countries. Now, you could argue that could be done because it's a Jewish state, right? It's a religious state, so it is different in some ways from other countries, but he's responding.
It's also a U.S. client state, right? So we have a different stake in it than, Moldova.
Right. We don't have a Moldovan American, significant majority. And so, there's a history of persecution of the Jewish people and so on. But what he's doing is, I think, maneuvering within that by saying, okay, I will treat Israel as I treat every other state. And I think he can be pretty progressive in that framework, which is why I expressed some surprise at the DSA move. But we'll explore all of that further in future shows. As always, Daniel Marans, great reporting and great analysis. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
It's my pleasure. I don't think that there is any other place on the internet where this topic will get this kind of discussion in a video format. And I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to use it as a platform to discuss those things.
I appreciate that. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.